I do believe that we're in a difficult situation now because the right is, at least on one issue, masquerading itself as the standard bearer of what has historically been an issue of the left. It's in a very different trajectory than the left. The agenda of the right is not my agenda.
Well, certainly not. But this is a void that's not going to get.
But many people it is, unfortunately. I cannot believe that. You would never believe how many emails I get. What do you mean the Israelis didn't kill Kennedy? How can you say that? You know, so irate, so indignant. You know, I don't know where things are headed, but for me, it's a source of concern as a person of the left.
I would love to have known Norman Finkelstein in the 1960s. What kind of teen were you?
What kind of teen was I? I was a militant Black power advocate in a neighborhood comprised homogeneously of lower middle class Jews. I didn't know a Black person.
we inspired you without having any proximity to you. The idea of us inspired you to action.
But I did have, speaking factually, from sophomore year to senior year, there was one African-American woman, I'll call girl because it's high school, in all our classes. You know, it was what were called the HB Honor Bright classes. They were the top classes. Her name was Valerie Bacon. And Valerie Bacon was the only Black woman, no Black guys. Every class.
Not very kosher. Valerie Bacon.
Yeah. And I think it's fair to say I did everything in my power to befriend her.
Why is that, Norm?
Because I wanted to, first of all, because all the kids were so racist. I'm talking about the Jewish kids, so racist. And I was raised differently. Now, she was an excellent student. In fact, on the English SAT, she got the highest score in the grade. That's a fact. She was, it turned out, Shirley Chisholm, a name I assume you know. She was Shirley Chisholm's niece. And I have many memories of her, and over the years, of course, I've tried to track her down with no success. That's the disadvantage or advantage of being a woman, because at that generation, they changed their names when they got married. So they all disappeared into the memory hole.
Yeah.
But I remember one conversation. I remember many conversations. It was a very charged relationship because Valerie was the one Black student. I remember my English teacher, Mr. Berger, he once made a comment about the Black sheep in the family. And then he looked at Valerie and he said, of course, in your case, it's the white sheep. Now, I think, remember, this is a very different era, Brianna. I think he was legitimately trying to navigate his way through having used the expression Black sheep. He didn't know how to do it. And she told me later that she went up to him at the end of class and told him she resented that remark. But that's not the anecdote I want to mention. The anecdote was Valerie got into Radcliffe. Of course, a huge achievement. She turned it down. She decided to go to what was called back then Jackson, which was the girls' school to Tufts University. I said, and Tufts was very good back then. I don't know if its standing is quite what it was back then. I said, Valerie, why didn't you go to Radcliffe? Now, here was her answer, which was a bit of it was a window into her life, which I didn't know. She said, because Harvard men don't date Radcliffe women. And for the first time in our friendship, it occurred to me Valerie was a sexual being. She was just the Black girl in the class. And nobody would think about asking her out for a date. Nobody would think about socializing with her. And that included me. And then when she gave me that response, it was, oh, so that's on her mind? Yeah, it was. It's hard for you because difference in age between us has to be a good 30 or nearly, yeah, at least 30 years. It was a very different era.
Not so
So,
different. Not so different, Norm. When I
uh,
was in college, certainly when I was in high school, and I want to preface this by saying I'm not complaining about this. I don't want this conversation to be construed as Brianna's complaining that white guys weren't interested, because I was not looking in their direction either. But the reality was that when I went out with non-black friends to non-black parties, I had absolutely no belief that I would be considered as a sexual object. I have joked with a friend of mine that going to a party, if it wasn't a black party, I might as well be a potted plant. That was the nature of things until, frankly, I'm going to mark it as Obama's getting into office. Black women became kind of popular after Michelle Obama was first lady, but the way interracial dating, specifically black women dating black women for non-black guys, is normalized now, and people thirst over. There's a lot of chocolate brown skin singers and hip hop artists and stuff that it's like very normal to thirst over. It was like if someone articulated an interest in black women, it was like, oh, well, that person dates black women. It was a novelty.
mhm. Well, that's still, in my opinion, but it's no point in dwelling over nuances. It's still one step removed from, or one step ahead from even conceiving Valerie as having any interest in the subject. It just never, it was just Valerie was the one Black student in all our classes: math, science, English, history, language, one Black person. And I made a point, and I do, I know it was very conscious given my family background. I was not going to make her feel unwanted. And in my day, I mean, the students were top students, the best, all
This was
huge,
this was
huge successes.
the high
Yeah,
school that Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Bernie Sanders and Chuck Schumer and everybody attended.
there are five Nobel laureates, five, five Nobel laureates.
But Norm,
But
I asked you what your memories of the
but let's
60s were
say,
like. I was
just,
curious about you. What kind of kid you were? I mean, certainly you had
I was
interests
very,
that were
I was,
outside of the academic or political.
say that again?
Certainly, I imagine you had interests that were outside
No,
of the
no,
political or
uh, uh,
academic.
no, I've said it, and I don't say it proudly. Like just a moment ago, you said I don't say this proudly or ashamedly. It's a fact. I'm at the end of life's trajectory. My entire life can fit on a bookshelf.
When you came home from school, did
I
you look
studied
forward to, did you never watch any
nothing.
television shows, baseball
I
games?
watched television until 1970. Yes, that's correct. Too
What happened
much.
to 19 Wait, what happened to 1970?
I went to college and I wanted to become a serious human being, and one of the first things to do was get rid of the television set.
So what were you watching prior to 1970 if you were watching too
Um,
much TV?
I watched, first of all, we in that era, a family typically only had one television. There was one TV in the house. Uh, and I think we had two eventually. I can't remember. We watched usually as a family. And we would watch the topical shows, which would be All in the Family, Mary Tyler Moore Show, The Smothers Brothers, the topical, the ones that had a social resonance. There were some very good, just brilliantly performed programs like The Honeymooners, which were not political, but generally was political. And my parents were uh, totally steeped in politics. They're down to the bones. So we watched Meet the Press, which back then was a serious program, Meet the Press and things like that. Channel 13 a lot, the educational station, a lot. We watched Channel 13.
Do you think that All in the Family understood something with Archie Bunker? The kind of cantankerous, well-meaning, says politically inappropriate, unwoke things, but kind of has a heart of gold. Do you think they understood something with that character that it seems like the Democrats are still struggling to get?
Uh, Carol O'Connor and Gene Stapleton were brilliant actors. They were just brilliant actors. So there was the script, and then there was them. And they were just, they moved you. Actually, Gene Stapleton, who played Edith, um, she played the oppressed housewife who loved her husband, both at the same time. She was abused by him, and sometimes on some programs, abused to the point that she was reduced to tears. But you had that contradiction, just like Archie Bunker, the endearing bigot, and Edith Bunker was the oppressed housewife who loved her husband to death, and vice versa, which made them kind of interesting characters. But that's an interesting character on paper. But when they took the roles, there was something really. There was Sally Struthers and Carl Reiner, who played the daughter and the son-in-law. Uh, they were okay. They weren't on the level of. So it was a program worth watching just to see really.
But in terms of the politics, since you bring it up, Norm, I'm curious because what it feels like is that in the wake of Trump's 2016 win, there was a real resistance to the idea that Archie Bunkers existed, right? There was all this talk about the Obama to Trump voter and a lot of words, a lot of ink was spilt over it. But when anyone was asked politically to contend with how a voter could have voted for Obama and then voted for Trump, the narrative was so strongly only racism could have made you vote for Trump that it didn't really allow for the idea of someone who might have had a mixed bags of belief,
Totally
maybe
agree.
was socially conservative in certain ways, maybe just was from a different time, didn't really mean ill by it, could vote for a black guy, but was also could easily be motivated by a mix of
Totally,
social things and genuinely left political promises,
right.
left economic
No,
populism
right.
promises. Yeah.
I totally agree with that. I think that um, I think that Bernie was fundamentally right, as was Zoran Mandani, that you can build a cross-racial alliance on the basis of common economic uh, demands and aspirations. However, that doesn't mean that racism is going to disappear. Of course, it's going to be there. How could it not be? 250 years of history, you can't, with the flick of a switch, erase that. I carry it. Everybody carries it. Everybody carries it's not a question of whether you carry the prejudice. The question is what you do with it. Do you fight it? Do you resist it? Do you acquiesce in it? Do you run with it? But the prejudice, of course, exists. And one of the interesting things reading W.E.B. Du Bois is watching his gradual evolution. He begins by thinking racism is just about ignorance. It's just so he sets himself on a project. He is going to educate people with the facts and the reality. So he starts with ignorance. Then he makes a trip to Africa and he reaches a new conclusion. He says racism is not fundamentally about ignorance, it's about profits. It's it's a way to extract, to use language I do not believe he used, to extract super profits. And he was looking at the slave trade and the uh, exploitation of Africa. And then along the way, he comes up with another theory. He says it's about uh, the wages of whiteness, that poor whites, they they would give up higher wages just so they won't be at the bottom of the heap, that the black people will be below them. So they didn't want to organize with black people, even though if they did, their wages would have improved. But Du Bois is very perceptive on how the ruling elite gives all of these allurements of power to white people, how certain sections of the city are accessible to them, but not to black people. They do all sorts of things to divide and conquer, and successfully. So Du Bois was very pessimistic about the possibility of a cross-racial alliance between black and white workers because he thought whites were so invested in maintaining their status one rung above black people. And then later in life, he discovers that there's so much to racism that's just irrational. You know, he refers in several places to what he calls, regarding black men, I'm using his expression, the sex jealousy, he calls it. And he says the truth of the matter is the irrational part of racism, the irrational part, not having to do with profits and not having to do with ignorance, just that irrational component. He acknowledges that's very hard to fight. It's very hard to fight. You know, you had these idiots, it already feels like ancient history, but you had people like Robin DiAngelo coining this phrase, we're going to interrupt racism. You know, it was like, so we're going to have a session, she called it, a session in which we're going to interrupt race. You can't control the mind.
Well, what did she mean by that? I'm sure she had something in
What she
mind.
meant was, give me a nice check, and I'm going to sit down with those white people and tell them what's what, and I'll be down with the hood and tell them, because you know black people are not able at a workplace to express their own feelings. They need Robin DiAngelo to have.
What was that what it was though? I mean, in all fairness,
Yeah, it was.
in all
Yeah,
fairness, the argument, as I recall it, that was being made at the time was
it's
that
funny.
it
Yeah,
wasn't
can I just stop
fair.
you for a moment? The argument that was being made at the time is like it's already gone. That whole phase is like
Well, I mean, that's true, and I mean, we talked about this on one of the times you were on more recently.
Mhm.
I asked you whether you felt any ambivalence about you know taking the time to focus on that particular phenomenon, given that in retrospect it was pretty short-lived, maybe in part because of the backlash that you contributed to, but also in the grand scheme of the enduring racism that you described and the indelibility of it all, that frankly I find myself missing an era where people articulated any kind of concern about racism, even if it was focused disproportionately on these sort of interpersonal office space problems, and that those problems were used as a stand-in for the broader issues of wealth inequality that, the political class wasn't offering any solutions to. I mean, if we're not going to get any reparations and we're not going to get any criminal justice reform, or we're not going to get housing as a human right or a living wage or Medicare for all, hell's bells. I mean, all things being equal, Robin DiAngelo doesn't feel like that big of a deal anymore.
I thought it was destructive, it was pernicious, and it was a distraction, which is why the corporate elite embraced it.
Right, but the critique, and the one that I join you in, is Democratic elites want to talk about this so they don't have to talk about that, right? The same way, this came up, I was just having dinner with some friends, and the Black maternal health gap came up, and it felt like a blast from the past. Like, that was what all of the politicians wanted to talk about to sort of prove their racial bona fides back in the 2020 era. And it's not that the Black maternal health gap isn't real and that Black women are dying disproportionately in labor and that these things that's not a real problem. But cynically, it very much felt like politicians were talking about that one narrow issue because it did the job of signaling some interest in healthcare, which people very much care about, without any structural changes a la Medicare for all, while also signaling their understanding that there are racially specific harms that need to be ameliorated, that a class first agenda like Bernie Sanders's wouldn't acknowledge. So it served this triple purpose. Don't talk about Medicare for all, signal that you like Black people, and hit class populists like Bernie and suggest that they don't get it. They don't get what Black people specifically have to go through. So I agree with you that it's being weaponized in this way. But to go back to my first part of this, I don't disagree that Black maternal health rate is a problem. And, I'm struggling as we head into all the discourse around 2028 with how to make those distinctions, because I can see them all ramping up to have a redux of that 2019 era primary, where everyone's rushing to pretend to be the kind of have the progressive lane. Everyone's trying to figure out how to say the right thing about Israel and Palestine and Iran and Lebanon without upsetting the donor class, but while getting all of the young people and the Muslims and the conscientious folks back on board. And without a Bernie in the race for everyone to sort of be competing with narratively, I think it's going to get very, very messy. You can see, I don't know if you've been following this. Let me ask you a more direct question. Have you been following all of the shifting tides around what is now the new norm of being able to say that you don't support funding for Israel's quote unquote defensive weapons, the Iron Dome, and that J Street has put out language that echoes what AOC previously said about a week in advance, that everyone's getting out of the game of saying that Israel should have its defensive weapons paid for by the United States?
Okay. First of all, I've not followed it. Secondly, I'm not clear on the issue. So AOC famously said that she voted for that House bill because she supported defensive as against offensive weapons for Israel. And you say the current script is?
So now there seems to be a permission structure where everybody across the political spectrum is now allowed to say they do not support American funding of the Iron Dome.
Mm-hmm.
And some folks have pointed out, Kate Willett being chief among them, and I think that she's right, that Netanyahu said back in January that he wanted to get off the American teat with respect to Iron Dome funding and that he could self-fund. And Republicans very shortly after followed suit in echoing that language. A week or two ago, AOC was pushed, ostensibly, the narrative went, to also saying that she no longer supported Iron Dome funding. And this was heralded as a real victory for progressives and the DSA who ostensibly pushed her. But now that so many others have followed suit in such quick succession, including J Street, including Scott Wiener, a bunch of people who aren't particularly progressive. It seems increasingly clear that what has happened, this is my editorialization, but it seems increasingly clear to me that what happened isn't that AOC moved the goalpost, as some are arguing. Matt Dess is arguing that, Ryan Graham is arguing it. But that, in fact, much like after Joe Biden's disastrous presidential debate, after which everyone was allowed to acknowledge that he was senile, it was that they were given the permission to say what had been obvious for a very long time. And similarly, because Netanyahu was already deciding, has already said that they're no longer going to switch up how the Iron Dome is being funded, everyone now has permission to say, I don't support Iron Dome funding, and it is no longer a marker of being particularly adversarial to Israel's interests or the military-industrial complex, the military duopoly, whatever, however you want to characterize it.
Well, before this program, I had sent you I'm not sure if you had a chance to watch it, and judging by the look on your face, you didn't. It was a quite interesting breakdown of the collapse of support for Israel in the United States, including Republicans under 50, including males across the board, all of the strong constituencies for Israel.
They have very much shifted away from Israel. Look at this. Net favorability of Israel among men under the age of 50. In 2022, not too bad, but not too hot to trot either at -3 points. By 2025, again, down we go, minus 22 points. That is a 19-point shift in just 3 years' time. But it gets even worse. Look at this for Israel. Minus 47 points. That's a 44-point shift away from Israel on the net favorability amongst young men who, of course, shifted massively into the Republican column back in 2024, and they have been shifting away from Israel over the last 4 years.
Support has collapsed in ways which are just, I would have to say, staggering. We're talking about, and maybe you'll be able to show your listeners after we do this interview. We're talking about shifts of 40 points in 2 years. 40 points in 2 years, like going from +3 to -40. Support of Israel. I'm giving you an example. The fellow went through many breakdowns. And so it is a new ball game for sure. And now the question is, in my opinion, it's always the question in politics, given the current and foreseeable balance of forces, what's the maximum you can realistically extract that's consistent with your long-term goal? That's what politics is about. You judge the balance of forces and what you might call the subterranean, the latent forces at a given moment. And then based on your assessment of now and where things seem to be headed, then you judge what's the maximum you can politically extract given the moment. And it's, as I said, I don't believe you just look at a snapshot like polls today. You have to have a feel for the people, so to speak. And you have to feel, which is not always registered in polls. You have to have a feel for the people. Where do you think at this particular moment you could take them? And judging by the polls, it's a new moment for sure. And then you have to figure out an agenda, a political agenda of what's realistic. What can you realistically hope to attain? And I bring this up not as a diversion, but to say, I'm not sure, and I'm not saying this in a peremptory way. I'm simply making it as an observation. I'm not sure the pro or against Iron Dome is the issue that should be focused on right now.
Well, I agree. I think that's my point.
Yeah, what the issue
That's
should be, I'm not sure. I'm not.
but that's the point that I'm trying to make, Dorm. I'm sorry if I haven't been clear. The what's frustrating about this is that it's being presented by some. This movement on the Iron Dome funding is being presented as evidence that we're quote unquote winning, that the left pushing is working, that the people who are early adopters to this language are in fact real. Wait a minute, are in fact real progressives, and people are getting a lot of political juice out of this. When in fact, I think it is a shell game, and that we are being fed the idea, the narrative that this is a logical extension of the polling shift that you pointed out, and that we should celebrate this as a win, when in reality, I think it's the establishment getting ahead of the polling shift and creating a new shell game to distract us from the fact that we should be making much more serious demands than changing language around iron domes.
I totally agree with that. I totally agree with that. Winning an Iron Dome may have meant something 2 years ago, but that's water under the bridge. We're in a new era. We're in a very okay, I don't like to say complicated or complex because everybody says that. But we are in I would have to say, a murky moment. And I've spoken about this in other programs, but I would certainly be happy to have the conversation with you as well. The murky moment is the following. Obviously, in the podcast world, the right and the far right is ascendant. If you look at, somebody sent me a breakdown, my friend Jamie Stern Weiner. It was circle graphs of the biggest podcasters. You saw it, good, so we're on the same page there. And the biggest was Elon Musk. I was very surprised, really surprised, unpleasantly surprised. Jackson Hinkle was a very large circle, a circle with a very large diameter. And if you looked at the whole graph, except for the ambiguous case of Mehdi Hassan, there was nobody on the left there. There was no one.
My recollection wasn't that was entirely true. I mean, it was certainly dominated by the right, but there were, I feel like there were figures like the Young Turks on there.
Well, first of all, I would call them the young jerks, but let's leave that aside. But you get my point. So
Yeah.
Let's just take it as a generalization to which there might be some exceptions, which I just don't know because I don't know the names in the podcast world. I only know Jackson Hinkle because I had some unpleasant encounters with him, where he presumed we were friends, and I guess he wouldn't use the word comrades, but he's not, and he never will be. In any event, so what happened is, and Brianna, you're free to disagree with me because you know the podcast world much better than myself. The right and the far right has seized on the Israel issue. And they have become the standard bearers of it. And it's not just that the agenda, the trajectory into which their Israel focus fits, the trajectory is, in my opinion, highly problematic. It's not just that they're making all sorts of, in my opinion, and here I will attach value a valence to my opinion, all sorts of claims which are so completely off the wall and bizarre. It's a mixture of these claims that are being made about Israel's perfidy are a mixture of Israel as a Rasputin-type character, a Svengali-type character, with Israel as the giant wire pullers, which is how Jews were depicted in the anti-Semitic era, controlling the world, controlling the banks, controlling everything. And it's not just cause for concern on where it's headed. It's cause for concern because the left used to be very grounded in politics based on facts, evidence. It was what you might call an evidence-based movement, the left. And now it's become this hodgepodge of conspiracy theories about everything. And you would be surprised. I was just talking to your producer about, for a few weeks, since October 7th, I became again the popular boy on the block. And that didn't last very long, because now I'm getting all of this very hostile email on the question of whether Trump is being blackmailed by Israel, and how can I say that the Israelis didn't kill Kennedy? And it's just gone
let's talk about it. Let's take that first
kind
one.
of bonkerinos.
Let's take the first one.
Mm-hmm.
The approach that I've seen, the most responsible approach that I've seen to this question of Trump and blackmail is a stance that goes something like, certainly Miriam Adelson gave Trump oodles of money, funded like a third of his entire campaign coffer. You don't give money to people who you don't expect favors from in return. Trump historically has been kind of responsive to the populist desires of his base. He is widely out of step with his base with this war in Iran. And one explanation of that certainly is that he is being influenced via money and politics to advance Israel's interests. A different version of that is that some more coercive Epstein files style situation is happening. We can't know if that is true, but it possibly might be true given how difficult it is to otherwise explain Trump's behavior. This line of reasoning was used by Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, and some others in a letter they published a few days ago. Did you catch that?
I've been listening to Tucker Carlson. And
so they said in this written response something along the lines of, we can't know if Trump is being blackmailed. If he is, we wish him the best. Like we are rooting for him to prevail upon the rise above the influences that are pulling him to behave in these ways that are so unpopular and bad. Kind of like calling him in instead of calling him out kind of approach to like saying, I hope you still do the right thing. So I want to ask you, given that if you maintain that, of course, we can't know or don't know for sure what's going on, but that there is some evidence that there's something anomalous going on, or there is just the basic human nature of what it means to give someone a whole bunch of money and have expectations. Do you not think that's a responsible and reasonable theory as to what's going on here with Donald Trump, that he is, in fact, being influenced to pursue Israel's national interests over our own?
There are many components to what you just said, and I would have to disaggregate them. First of all, I was listening to Tucker Carlson a couple of days ago, and he was, I would say, I'm trying in my mind to capture the words. I think he was pretty clear in saying that Trump is being blackmailed by Israel. There's no evidence for that. It's possible. It's possible. I can't rule that out. But is there any evidence for that claim? The answer is zero. would Trump, as opposed to would Trump be influenced by his campaign contributions? The answer to that is an emphatic yes. Not only because most politicians are responsive to their donors, but also because Trump is an unusually corrupt individual. And so he would not think twice about soliciting money, which he can make use of for his own personal gain. So that seems to me certainly the case. But as you know, there's an expression called Occam's razor. Occam's razor is sometimes the simplest explanation is the most plausible explanation. Not sometimes. Occam's razor is the simplest explanation is the most plausible explanation. And if you look at Donald Trump's character, if you look at the concrete situation in which he was situated at the time he made the decision to go to war with or launch a war of aggression against Iran, colluding with Israel, there seems to be, in my opinion, I didn't find it particularly perplexing why he would make that decision. He had two successes, namely, he could claim that he ended the war in Gaza. In fact, I don't think it's true, but he made the claim and it seemed plausible, so plausible that he thought he would win the Nobel Peace Prize for it. And then he had the immaculate coup in Venezuela. And so that kind of produced a kind of hubris on his part that he's a diplomatic, or I should say, he's a statesman of genius and also a force of power of genius. And then he had two failures. The two failures were, there was the colossal one of Greenland, where the headlines for at least a month, maybe more, were Trump is not backing down. I'm taking Greenland. No way. I'm taking Greenland. Caused a huge I wouldn't call it a hysteria, a huge controversy, whatever you want to call it. And then he has to walk away from it. And Greenland is left behind. And then he had another big disaster, which is kind of forgotten, although from the point of view of the left, it was very significant. It was the disaster of Minnesota. He was going to send advice. He was going, all the headlines again with Minnesota, and he's going to stop these people, this popular uprising, which really was, in middle America, overwhelmingly white people, in defense of undocumented workers. Very impressive. He lost there too. He had to withdraw. So between the two successes and the two failures, the trajectory to Iran wasn't far. It wasn't far when you consider the following fact. The following fact was, as you know, Trump assembled in his administration a collection of sub-mediocre yes men. There's never been anything like an administration like Trump, really, in terms of the competence, the sheer level of knowledge. There's never been anything like it. Even people like Ronald Reagan, who's basically, writer Gore Vidal used to say about Ronald Reagan, he's our acting president with the double entendre, because Ronald Reagan was brain dead. He spent around 3 hours a day working, mostly just eating his jelly beans. But he chose as a Secretary of State George Shultz. Shultz knew what he was doing. Nixon chose Henry Kissinger. Obama chose Hillary Clinton, and then John Kerry, and then we get Marco Rubio. No, that's not in the same trajectory. It's not in the same ballpark. And it's true across the board. It's true across the board. Pete Hegseth, as I said the other day, you know, I don't know if he's Secretary of War, Secretary of Defense, or Secretary of Hair Gel. Just never seen a character like this. He's got more oil running through the strands of his hair than there is oil running through the Straits of Hormuz in any 1 week. I mean, these are laughable characters. And Trump purposely selected them because they were sub-mediocre yes men. He didn't want anyone to outshine him, and he likes to have his ego massaged. But now that presented a problem. When he turned his attention to Iran, there was an information void. He knew it.
So you think Occam's razor is that Trump just made a mistake. He made a mistake with Greenland. He made a mistake with Minnesota. He made a miscalculation, a strategic miscalculation, and Iran is one of the same.
Yeah, I think it's, for somebody from my generation, presidents always make mistakes like that. I grew up with Lyndon Baines Johnson. That was a protracted mistake. It was called the war in Vietnam.
Right, but I think the problem, with all of that analysis is that even the Vietnam War, making it kind of framing these interventions as I wouldn't have done it if I thought I would win, as opposed to what the U.S. military does and what the military-industrial complex requires, which is that we be at war regardless of whether or not we win, I think is an unsatisfying framing, because it doesn't also account for why Biden did the will of Netanyahu, and why Kamala Harris was willing to lose an election, and in fact did lose an election over her unwillingness to break with Benjamin Netanyahu and with Israel policy generally speaking. In some ways, Trump's first term was more anomalous in not, famously saying, quote unquote, I didn't start any new wars, than what he's doing now. And with all of these characters, I think there is this question constantly since the beginning of the genocide on October 7th. Why is it that we're so willing to allow Israel to get away with so much? And the blackmail aspect of it, I think people keep reaching for because it offers some explanation that seems beyond what can be accounted for geopolitically. Especially given that Donald Trump, unlike some of these other characters, has such a direct connection with this huge blackmail ring story of Jeffrey Epstein. And so it does feel sort of inevitable that there'd be something going on there, not to mention that he also just fired Pam Bondi, who's getting all the flack from the Epstein files cover up. I'm not invested in this. I don't need that. I don't need there to be some smoking gun per se, but I'm curious why it seems to bother you in particular that that the Tuckers and Candaces of the world are entertaining that possibility. And by the way, before you answer, maybe it would be helpful for us just to play this clip. It's Candace Owens reading the letter I alluded to earlier that was written by Tucker Carlson in response to Donald Trump's criticism of the right-wing conservative cohort that has come out as critical of Israel and Very America First.
Tucker actually has the right idea. So he published this letter, and I'm going to read it. He writes, he's in a tough spot, referring to President Donald Trump. Establishment media never reports this, but the Israeli government has a storied history of blackmailing U.S. presidents. Perhaps the most jarring example occurred in the 90s when Israel used recordings of Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky, phone sex sessions as leverage to pressure Clinton into releasing convicted spy Jonathan Pollard from prison. We are not joking, that really happened. The phone sex story is worth remembering as President Trump attempts to end the Iran war. Like many other things Israel has done, it shows that America's special ally is willing to play very dirty to achieve its goals. Dark money, campaign contributions, extortion, physical threats, and even assassination. In their anti-Christian worldview, the end always justifies the means. They have no issue destroying lives. Israel's current top priority is making sure Operation Epic Fury does not stop. They know the U.S. fighting their war for them is the best chance at expanding their borders and becoming a global superpower, and a peace deal would foil their plot. Based on the country's past, its leaders are doubtlessly willing to push as hard and as necessary to ensure the bloodshed continues. That could mean Clinton-style blackmail against Trump or something far more morbid. We do not know for sure whether that is happening, but the mere possibility is haunting enough to keep the president up at night. He is under a level of pressure that most people cannot fathom, with rabid Israel firsters viciously harassing him anytime he dares to stray even slightly from their favorite country's agenda. Their shameless pursuit is steadfast enough to make even a man like Donald Trump go mad. They are as persistent as any group in history, no matter how well the White House has treated them in the past. They are never grateful. They always want more, and they refuse to give the president even an inch of breathing room. It is an unrelenting full-court press. We decided to write this after Trump published a Truth Social post attacking our company, Megyn Kelly, Candace Owens, and Alex Jones, each of whom supported him for years. Rather than engaging in petty name-calling, we want to give the president some grace. He is facing a level of pressure that is dark enough to make him abandon his campaign promises and morph into the precise kind of politician he once vowed to destroy. He would not have let that happen unless his personal stakes were really high. We hope he overcomes.
So my problem with this is only that it feels like Candace and Tucker and them are trying to exonerate Trump, make him less culpable by saying he's being blackmailed, a way to criticize Trump without roiling the MAGA base who wants to believe the best in Trump. But generally speaking, outside of what I think the political utility of this argument is, I don't take objection to it the way it seems like you feel like this is bridging on a kind of anti-Semitism and string pulling, I think is the phrase that you used.
I'm not sure if I'm prepared now to go into this because, first of all, as I said, you have to disaggregate. There are so many things going on at once. And I acknowledge, because I never quarrel with facts, Tucker Carlson was the first one in the media, in the web world, who came out against the war against Iran. He apparently made several trips to the White House to counsel Trump not to do it, and he said it was going to be a debacle, and it turned out to be a debacle, and that has to be acknowledged. However, the problem is his stock will now go through the roof because he'll have the aura of a prophet, P-H-E-T, the aura of a prophet. And the problem with prophets is they come as a package. A prophet is just right next door to a guru. And so you then start to take it en masse. In what you just read to me, I thought it was complete nonsense. We have to disagree or gently agree to disagree because I've read a lot about the Clinton White House. I found Clinton, horrible, his program, his agenda, but he was an interesting as a statesperson. I found him interesting, certainly very knowledgeable. This thing about Israel, we know, says Tucker Carlson, that the Israelis had secret tapes of Clinton and Lewinsky. I actually never even heard that story. This is the first
I'm not familiar with it either, but for the sake of those listening and not watching, there were articles that were thrown up on the screen as Candace was talking about this. I see it was reported out by the Times of Israel back in 2014, but that's neither here nor there. I also am not familiar with this story. But it was a claim that was made in a book on the Clinton family that was published at the time. Take that for what it will.
Well, I would take it as a zero. I would have to know who the book was, who the publisher was, who the author was. I would have to know what the evidence was. I would take it as a starting point. I would take it as a zero.
It's someone named Daniel Halper in the book, just for the sake of completion. It's called Clinton Inc., The Audacious Rebuilding of a Political Machine. And it apparently relies on on-the-record interviews with former officials together with a close analysis of documents termed the Monica Files to paint a salacious and uncomplimentary picture of one of the most prominent political families in the United States. That's the blurb from the Times of Israel.
I'm sure if you look at Clinton's personal life. It will be very unflattering. About that, I have no doubt. But like as I said to Avram before the program, you have before you go from A to Z, there are a lot of dots that you have to connect. So it can be true his personal life is very unflattering, as was JFK's, but you can't jump from JFK had a salacious personal life to the Israelis got tapes of JFK with all of his women and then assassinated him. I mean, we have a lot of dots to connect. And then we have Tucker Carlson. He doesn't claim he has any evidence that Clinton is being blackmailed. He doesn't have any evidence. But then he goes on to say, well, we know that Trump is up at night and he's sweating and his heart is palpitating because he's under so much pressure. Okay, from no evidence and pure speculation, we now have fact. We know that Clinton is up at night and he's sweating bricks over all of the pressure that is being exerted. There's no evidence for that. But the problem, Brianna, is because you asked me, and it's a fair question. Why am I concerned about this? I'm concerned about it because I believe a large part of even what calls itself the left is being seduced by these wild conspiracy theories that have no basis in fact, and which largely are emanating from the far right, which dominates the media space.
But
now.
Isn't that the problem? Because here we are. I mean, you're sitting here talking to me.
That's the problem.
You're sitting here talking to me, who's someone who obviously was unceremoniously ejected from having some kind of platform to be critical of Israel from the left when I was fired from Rising. Voices like mine are not invited onto MSNBC or CNN for the most part. Emma Vigeland gets on there sometimes and a handful of others, but they are the panels are rigged so that they're very much outnumbered and overwhelmed, and it ends up being akin to a screaming match on Piers Morgan. Piers Morgan is one of the few that will also allow Israel critical left voices on, but for the most part, he has people like Candace Owens on who do a formidable job of articulating the point. In fact, I think I put a recent clip, a back and forth between Candace and Piers on in the chat. We can listen to it. That was very satisfying to listen to, precisely because the only people who are allowed on these programs, in large part, to advance these arguments are conservatives, and because conservatives have such a big audience that it frankly goes a lot farther than someone like you or me.
I started out in the same place as you. I said, there's a real problem, and we both were attentive to that graph depiction.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
what's I mean, like, here's the better way for me to ask this.
I think we have to be concerned about it as a problem.
But what does that mean? So let's say we're concerned about it, because I too I'm less concerned about the blackmail angle of it. That doesn't, frankly, we're living in a conspiracy time. There's not a conspiracy. You know, I have whole Instagram chats with girlfriends who we joke about. We spam the chat with every conspiracy that floats up on Instagram, because it just feels kind of wild and giddy and strange and surreal, the world that we live in, and we're all kind of we'll entertain everything sort of a mind space. But that aside, yeah, I am concerned, because it does feel like there's a lot of political appetite for being Israel critical. It is on the left and the right in terms of the base, in terms of the voter base, but only predominantly on the right with respect to politics. My fear is that what Tucker Carlson is doing is creating space within the Republican Party for there to be an Israel critical wing, so that when elections come, someone can run and speak to that wing and claim to be from that side of the party without being polluted by Donald Trump. Democrats are too stupid to do the same thing, or simply unwilling to do the same thing. And they're spending all of their time and energy trying to crush Hassan Piker as a human being and anybody who ever liked him or would caucus with him. And so therefore, whoever runs on the Democratic side of the aisle is going to have to own every single thing establishment Democrats, Joe Biden, ever said or did. Whereas Republicans are going to be able to brand themselves as a Tucker Carlson Republican. and they're going to be able to ride that energy to the White House again, potentially. So that is why I'm concerned about it. But it also strikes me as sort of, I struggle to know what I'm supposed to do about it when, frankly, the Candace Owens and Tucker Carlsons of the world are doing a competent job saying and doing things that me and those of us on the left get fired for saying and doing. And what am I supposed to do? Like, what are we supposed to do about that?
Well, depends on what you mean by a competent job.
Well, let's play. Can we?
As I said, I acknowledge.
Why? What is your theory?
I don't know. I don't know.
But
I don't
what's
know.
your theory then? You must have an idea.
My theory is that we should investigate everything strange that happened on that day so we can figure out what happened.
But are you suggesting
Why is everybody why are we pretending that we don't know why we ask questions? Like, why? Like, you're a journalist.
You know
what this is. You're like, what's going on? What's going on? Why do you want to know why these planes were tracking Charlie? Well, my theory is that we are being sold absolute Fed slop. The media is doing their Operation Mockingbird Part 2 scenario by telling us, well, unless you absolutely have a conclusion, you can't even ask the question. Yes, we very well can. Keep asking consistent questions until we get a clarified explanation for what happened on that day. And right now, we have nothing, okay? And that is the reason why people are watching my show, because I'm the only one not treating them like they're absolute idiots who don't have two eyes and who believe in magic bullet theory and who understand that Egyptian planes should not have been tracking Charlie even 3 times this year would be an anomaly, okay? They've been tracking him. We don't know where it's going to end, but we are going to keep asking questions until we get clear answers.
Candace, it may be that the person in the media spewing bullshit to the public is you.
No, nice try. It's not. It's you by saying, why are you asking questions? Don't you worry about Mikey's feelings? Everyone knows what this is. And like I said, because we have the example, the concrete example of after JFK's assassination, the media members quite literally being put on the payroll of the CIA, we have a historical example that we can look at and go, we're not doing that again. Doesn't matter how many times you keep telling the public that I'm spewing bullshit. It is only because there has not been anything that has come out of this investigation that makes any sense that the public is not listening to. I am sorry to say this, Piers, people like you. And what I love about you and I sitting down is that this exact same time last year, you were doing the same weird questioning and making all these things when I said that they were committing a Holocaust against the Gazans, and then you changed your mind.
Actually,
Piers,
this time,
I'll see you next year when you change your mind again, and we have more information about what happened, and you realize that the difference between me and you is that I have the courage to take the risks and ask the questions first, okay, before it's popular. You wait until it becomes popular, and then you change your mind.
I acknowledge Carlson was right on Iran. And I would have to say the letter he wrote or the email or, I don't know, all these things. Was it a post somewhere in which he castigated Trump for, on Easter Sunday it was, for his about wanting to destroy civilization, Iranian civilization, and he said that's just pure evil. I have to say, I'm embarrassed to say it, especially at my age and being a person of the bona fide left, I was actually touched by the sentiments he articulated. They actually had a portion of humanity in them, which I find very unusual nowadays. But when he says things like, Israel wanted to drag the United States into the war because it wanted to weaken the United States so that Israel can form a new alliance with India. I think to myself, where is this coming from? As I told you.
I don't know is that something that was in that clip?
No, it was a program probably around 3 weeks ago. Every once in a while when I'm exercising at home, I turn on Tucker Carlson to pass the time. Or when Candace Owens, when I was interviewed by her, and I have to acknowledge she had me on, which nobody in that league would have me on. So I have to.
Same, she had me on after I was fired.
Yes, I know that. And that was actually a relief to me when she mentioned that to me. And she started to say that actually everybody who claims to be a Holocaust survivor was actually a Russian Bolshevik who had murdered millions of Christians and was now pretending to be a Holocaust survivor. Where is this coming from?
She said that to you during the interview?
Yeah. Yeah.
What did you say to her? I don't remember that part. What did you say to her?
I said, well, you do have a point. A lot of people who claim to be Holocaust survivors are fakes. Why? Because the Nazi Holocaust was very efficiently achieved.
Mm.
It was an industrial style assembly line extermination. So of course there were very few actual survivors. That's true. As my late mother used to say, if everybody who claims to be a survivor actually is one, then who did Hitler kill? Nobody. Very few people survived. The numbers are in 1945 under 100,000. By the 2000s or 1990s, it was down to maybe a few thousand were still alive. Some people nowadays, even people claiming to be on the left, say they're Holocaust survivors. Well, you know what? I buried my parents in 1995. That's 30 years ago. I find it most implausible that there are more Holocaust survivors than you can count on the fingers of your hand and exclude the toes on your feet. So I told her, yeah, but that doesn't prove that the Nazi Holocaust never happened. Mm-hmm. Actually, the fewness of the survivors proves it did happen because it was so efficient. But obviously, but when I'm hearing this stuff, and when Tucker Carlson, with his dramatic description of Trump up at night, or he says, I know for a fact, this is when he was interviewing Huckabee. I know for a fact, either it was Huckabee or it was Ted Cruz, but I believe it was Huckabee. He said, I know for a fact that it was Israel that dragged us into the Iraq war in 2003. I know that for a fact. Well, as a factual matter, I think I've read everything there is to read on the 2003 Iraq war. I don't think there's any evidence for it. Dick Cheney was not Jewish. Donald Rumsfeld was not Jewish. Everybody acknowledges they were the architects of the war.
But that's not, not to defend, I'm prepared to agree with you, but just, that's not the claim. The claim isn't that these people were Jewish. The claim is that they might have been influenced by Israel.
Right, but you know what? Without going into the details, and I don't think you would want to in this program because it's just going to lead us astray. Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, they were very smart guys. They were very competent guys. They were very conscientious guys. They had been involved in politics for 40 years. They were not babes in the woods. They started out, believe it or not, in the Nixon administration. They went very far back. Nobody tricks Dick Cheney. Nobody tricks Donald Rumsfeld.
Right, but it's not, the argument also isn't necessarily that they were tricked. It's that there is a maybe shared interest,
there was an overlapping interest. Absolutely.
Or take for example, the argument that Israeli intelligence, which tracks the whereabouts of every Palestinian at every moment of the day, must have known about October 7th and basically allowed it to happen. There's the evidence. I don't have it as encyclopedic memory of this as someone like Max Blumenthal. But that they moved troops away from that portion of the wall, soldiers away from that portion of the wall, allowed it to happen to create the pretext to do the genocide that's happening now. So you can call that a trick. Israel tricked America into allowing it to have this, territorial expansion war, that it created all of this as an excuse to bomb Lebanon and Iran and every other country in the region. Is that so implausible? Maybe you don't want to use the word trick, but the idea that Israel has been hankering to bomb Iran and to weaken its other regional powers since time immemorial.
And I think they did. I do believe they, as I've said in many other interviews, I do believe they tipped the balance in Trump's case. I believe that there was an information void. Trump didn't trust any of his advisors, and he knew they were yes men. So before he made the final decision, I do believe that he weighed heavily, and it tipped the balance. He weighed heavily what Netanyahu had to say. And what Netanyahu had to say had a surface plausibility. Iran is on the brink. Those huge demonstrations, the thousands of people that the Iranian government killed, the low figure is 7,000, and the high figure is in the tens of thousands. I tend to go with the low figure, but I'm not going to say still, you will agree, killing 7,000 people in the streets and demonstrations is a very large number. There's a huge amount of discontent. Netanyahu tells Trump that we have our agents everywhere, which they did. And he tells them it's going to be a cakewalk, just like Ken Adelson told Rumsfeld and Cheney in 2003. And of course, to soup up Donald Trump, Netanyahu says, you will emerge as the great statesman. You will be a hallowed figure in American history for having overthrown this government, the satanic government. And I think Trump went for it. I think that's all true. But
so is that not fair? Is that what are we're objecting to calling that being tricked by Netanyahu?
No, I wouldn't say. Well, first of all, I wouldn't say it's being tricked. I think Netanyahu believed it, and I think
right.
Trump,
but well,
they did play a factor. But was it contrary? Well, let me just give two counterfactuals. Why I believe Israel tipped the balance is, had Trump consulted Israel because he doesn't trust his coterie surrounding him, and had Israel said the opposite, had Israel said, don't do it, it'll be a disaster. You know, the people are going to rally behind the government, and there are a lot of crazy fanatics in the population. If he had said the reverse, I don't believe Trump would have done it.
Well, aren't you making the case for Netanyahu tricking, misleading, persuading, whatever you want to say, Trump into doing it?
I would say he persuaded. I think he tipped the balance.
So what's the objection then? I want to ground us. What then is the original objection to Tucker and Candace and co?
The original objection is very simple. The claim is made that the Israelis had to have played the decisive factor because an attack on Iran was so contrary to U.S. interests. The whole thing is always cast as this innocent United States that's being tricked. The wool is being pulled over its eyes, and it's always these wire pullers in Israel who are behind it. The United States has been on a collision course with Iran since 1979. We're talking about a very long time.
In some ways, but not in other ways. Under Obama, you have the...
There is fluctuations, for sure. But for those of us who have a memory that goes back, I have a very clear memory of the 2000s.
But we can't collapse 80 years of history and act as though Trump isn't behaving differently. We had a nuclear deal.
Behaving differently.
Trump got out, ended it.
In 2003, the attack in Iraq was supposed to be the stepping stone to Iran. It was supposed to be Iraq, Syria, Iran. That was the plan. The one place where the United States and Israel differed at that point was originally Israel wanted Iran to be first. Cheney and Rumsfeld and their advisors said, no, Iran's going to be last. Now, it didn't work out, but nobody would make the claim that Cheney and Rumsfeld weren't contemplating the U.S. national interest as they perceived it when they did that.
Right. So I'm of two minds because, like I said, I don't like I believe that Tucker's political interest in using this framing is to exculpate Donald Trump and to create space for people who like Donald Trump to disagree with his policy and still stay within the Republican Party. So on that, I'm on the same page. But I don't know that I agree that this framing is necessarily, I do think there's some truth to it. And I don't think that if there is truth to it, that it is an anti-Semitic truth, or the idea that Israel is, for whatever reason, in whatever way, influencing U.S. policy and creating outcomes that would be different, largely or in part, than if it weren't influencing U.S. policy. I don't know. I don't know that I would characterize that as.
I didn't use that term, and I was careful not to use that term.
Which term?
Anti-Semitic.
Okay, so what did you mean by this string pulling?
These are fair questions, so I'd like to answer them. First of all, I don't believe facts can be anti-Semitic. Israel has played a very perfidious role in American life, and that's just a fact. And its supporters, who, unlike others, I don't believe they're Zionists. I don't think Zionism, in my opinion, and I did write a doctoral dissertation on the topic, so I have a right to speak on it, I suppose. My doctoral thesis was on the theory of Zionism. Zionism had one basic tenet. The basic tenet was, that's a redundancy. The tenet was that there's no future for Jews in the non-Jewish world. Either they would be assimilated, that was one fear, or they would be exterminated. That was the other fear. And a Zionist meant that because there was no future for Jews in the non-Jewish world, they needed to establish a state of their own and live there. As there was a famous social critic named Irving Howe, and he once said, if you have $100 in your pocket and you can buy a one-way plane ticket to Israel and you haven't, you're not a Zionist. And I think that's factually true. If you decide there's a future for Jews in the non-Jewish world, you're not a Zionist. And if you have enough money to purchase a one-way ticket and you haven't, then you're not a Zionist. What they are, in my opinion, I try to be precise in my language, they're Jewish supremacists. They think Jews are better. That's how we grew up. That's how we were raised. Jews are better. I think it was Philip Roth, the novelist, who said, growing up, there was one thing that was drilled into our head over and over again: Jews are better. It's a Jewish supremacist solidarity. I acknowledge, I think nobody can credit me with being shy about being highly critical of the way Jews have carried on in American society. It's a real problem. And now, unfortunately, in the immortal words of Malcolm X, the chickens are coming home to roost. A real problem is developing. I think I was the first one, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, during the assaults on the encampments in spring of 2024. I was the first one who sounded the alarm and said these Jewish supremacists are destroying academic freedom in our country. And I was not shy about that. I named the people and I said, no, don't tell me it's the Republicans. No, it's not. It's Bill Ackman. It's Barry Sternlicht. And they did. They destroyed academic freedom in our country. And it still remains. Even this whole year, I was only invited to speak at 2 colleges in the whole country. Everybody's terrified. I'm not afraid to say that. And I don't consider it anti-Semitic. Those are facts. Those are facts that Jews have played a very, sadly, very pernicious role in American society. So I have no problem with that. I do have a problem, I have to say, with two things. Problem number one, in the wrong hands, that sort of information, embellished as I believe a lot of it now is, can become a serious problem. In the wrong hands, because it's subject to all sorts of embellishments, which I believe are very far from reality. And secondly, because it projects this myth of the United States, this, what you said, this virginal innocence, and it's simply being, if these outsiders, these foreign agents weren't here, it would be a beautiful place. And that, unfortunately, for a generation which has very little knowledge of our history, very little interest in acquiring that knowledge, that is a seductive idea. It's a seductive idea.
Yeah, and it's not dissimilar from what Tucker Carlson says about immigrants and a whole host of other people that are ruining America.
Yeah, that's true. However, at this particular moment, I think it's become, I don't want to exaggerate the nature of the problem, but it's become, I think, a problem because when I start hearing these things, Israel wanted to weaken the United States so that it can have an alliance with India, I think.
I mean, but the problem,
Where
Norm, is that
where are these things coming from?
I mean, I literally can't respond to that because I'm not saying it wasn't said, but I've literally never heard that.
Believe me, I couldn't make that up.
I don't dispute it, but here's the problem. The problem is what everybody's hearing is the clips that are put into our information streams that are that very much confirm our own priors with respect to Israel coming out of the mouths of Tucker Carlson. So I want to play this viral clip from April 12th between Tucker Carlson and this, I think, a BBC reporter, and get your response. Put this into the record, as it were.
Pretty much everything that you've said in our conversation, Tucker Carlson, you have put at the door of the Israeli government. Now, to some people, that will be evidence that you are anti-Semitic. You are anti-Jewish.
Oh, I know. I'm very anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish. Well, first of all, the state of Israel does not speak for all Jews at all, despite its claims. It does not. There are many, many Jews, many of whom I know, who don't think the Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu speaks for them.
No,
I'm speaking of the government, not religion.
Hold on. Because I wasn't suggesting that.
Of course you were suggesting
what
that.
I was suggesting was that a lot of the
I've been in
things
this
that you've
business
discussed
longer
today,
than you, and I understand what a slur looks like. And you're attempting to call me an anti-Semite in a passive-aggressive way. Some people would say that. Well, I'm responding to your slur and saying that it's untrue. It does not apply to me. Doubtless there are anti-Semites who don't like Israel. I'm not an anti-Semite. I don't hate Israel. The Israeli government, this is documented, and I saw it personally, steered the United States into a war that hurts the United States and the world. I'm offended by that. I didn't want it, and I'm mad about it now. I have every right to feel that way. That does not make me an anti-Semite, despite your insinuation. And I think it's important that I say that. And by the way, I hope that you run this. I can't control whether or not you air this exchange. I hope that you will, because I think it's important to push back against slurs like that, because they limit our ability to understand what's actually happening. This is not an attack by Jews on the United States. This is Benjamin Netanyahu moving the United States to do something he thinks will benefit him, but that does not benefit us. It's that simple.
Tucker Carlson, thank you very much.
You want my reaction?
Mm-hmm.
I do believe a lot of what Tucker Carlson says is accurate. I think I've said that. I do. But then it starts.
In this clip,
I would agree, as I said, I would agree that Israel tipped the balance about that. I can't say I know for certain. I don't know what goes on in that man's mind, the guy who currently occupies the White House. But I'm reasonably confident that that's what unfolded. On the other hand, I said to you earlier, Brianna, I said I was going to present to you two counterfactuals. The first counterfactual was, if Israel had counseled against it, I don't think Trump would have done it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't. But there's another counterfactual, which goes to the heart of my disagreement with Tucker Carlson. And perhaps with you, though I'm not clear yet. What if it turned out to be a cakewalk? It didn't, but I'll tell you the truth. I'm not very knowledgeable on Iran. I know what a generally literate person knows. I've read several books on the subject. I can't claim to have read more than that. I didn't know which way it would go. I wasn't sure whether the people would turn against. I wrote my an old friend of mine, not close anymore. His name is Evan Siegel, who knows as much about Iran as I know about Gaza, which is to say quite a lot. And I said to him, what do you think? Will they rally around the flag or will they turn against the regime? And he said, Norm, that's the big question. Very hard to predict. Very hard to predict how the people will react to the aggression. And it could have turned out a cakewalk for all I know. It could have. So now here's the counterfactual. Let's say it turned out to be a cakewalk. Is there anybody in the ruling elites who would not have celebrated the defeat of Iran?
Well, they're practically celebrating now. Like, I think I mentioned that Hillary Clinton, I'll see if I can dig up the clip afterward and put it in, but was basically saying, yeah, sure, I wouldn't have done it, but I'm glad that Lebanon now has the best leadership than it's had in a while.
But we see Hezbollah is not by any means defeated because we're engaged in a war now in southern Lebanon. I would wish the following. Number one, and finally there seems to be some opening here. I've been advocating behind the scenes for this now for several months. Israel should support this Lebanese government. There has not been a better Lebanese government since the Syrians and Iranians assassinated Hariri. They are trying. Do they have all the capacity they need? No. But they are trying to set up a government in Lebanon that can deal with the threat that Hezbollah poses internally to Lebanon. And so rather than making their task even harder, work with this new government in Lebanon. See how far you can help them to go to disarm Hezbollah.
Yeah. So it's not as if the United States had no interest in the war and it was duped or tricked by Israel into waging an aggression contrary to its national interest as perceived by its leaders. Of course, the United States would, everybody, Chuck Schumer, everybody would have celebrated the destruction of Iran. That's how our national interest has been defined. I don't agree with it, but that's how it's been defined by the ruling elite since 1979. Iran has to be stopped. So this whole depiction of this pristinely innocent United States, which was tricked into waging a war that wasn't in its national interest, that's just so silly. The problem was we lost. We lost, just like in 2003. It turned into a debacle. But you'll never hear these people saying that. And if we want to be honest, and I don't believe Tucker Carlson always is, even though he enjoys this feigned naivete and simplicity, I think there is a large amount of disingenuousness going around, happening. When he speaks about all of these Americans who are foreign agents. All of these Americans who are foreign agents. He's not just talking about the people supporting Netanyahu. It's just not true. Now, I believe, Brianna, I want to be clear about this. I agree with what you just said a moment ago. You didn't say it in these terms, but I'll just add to what you say, which is accurate. You said Tucker Carlson does the same thing with immigrants. And that's true. And ICE is not chasing down Jews, it's chasing down immigrants. So we're not in the same boat as immigrants. That's a fact. It's a fact. And I'm not going to ignore that fact. But I do believe, and I'm going to have to end this, but I'll be very happy to come back to you another day because I find you delightful as an interlocutor and as a person. I do believe that we're in a difficult situation now because the right is, at least on one issue, masquerading itself as the standard bearer of a leftist issue. Well, it has historically been an issue of the left. And it's in a very different trajectory than the left. It's a very different trajectory. The agenda of the right is not my agenda.
Well, certainly not. But this is a void that's not going to get.
But many people it is, unfortunately. I cannot believe that. You would never believe how many emails I get. What do you mean the Israelis didn't kill Kennedy? How can you say that? So irate, so indignant. I don't know where things are headed, but for me, it's a source of concern as a person of the left, that these have now become the spokespersons on the leftist issue. Now they have if I can use the term, they have hijacked the issue. And I believe they can take it in places which are grounds for concern. Though it's not the priority now. The priority, as I said, ICE is not knocking on the doors of Jews. It's knocking on the doors of undocumented workers. I get that. I have no problem with that. I think we'll leave it at that. And certainly,
I gotta say, normally I'm used to you when we record late like this. You like to go real late, and I usually am the one trying to hang up on you so I can run and close my rings real quick before midnight. I closed my rings earlier today with the 10K that I completed before 3 p.m. Eastern, and I cleared my schedule for you, Norm.
But we did an hour and a half.
That's never stopped us. We've done 3-hour sessions before.
Brianna, unfortunately, I have a court case and I have to prepare.
Okay, I'll let you go. But if you would indulge me, I just wanted to ask you one more question. I thought we had time because the main reason I wanted to talk to you tonight was to talk about this question of BDS and some pushback that you've been getting about a position that you had in the past that was critical of the BDS movement. And whether or not you shared with me a paper that you had written about 10 years ago on the subject, where some of the evidence, some of the facts at the time that you relied on to make your argument seem to have changed.
Right. That's why I sent you the clip to give you more evidence to support against me of the change in public opinion. But
right. But since this is another issue that, sort of keeps coming up, I wondered if you do have a sort of new and clarified position on it, if you could summarize it for us as we close.
Okay. I'll make a few brief points. Number one, I don't believe in politics there is an abracadabra formula that's relevant at every point in time in every historical juncture. You have to look, assess at every particular juncture. You have to see what is the right demand to make. So, for example, on college campuses now, if you were to ask me, should the issue be BDS? No, I think the obvious issue on college campuses now has to be to reclaim the right to free speech. That has to be in the forefront.
Are those separable, given that they were advocating for BDS for their campuses to divest from Israel, and that's why they got
right, but they're not completely overlapping. I think there has to be a very aggressive, but hopefully broad struggle to reclaim
And
the right
what's
to
the point
speech.
of reclaiming the right to speech if you can't apply it to the? I mean, the reason I would argue that they came down so hard on those protesters is because of what they were advocating for. They don't come down on protesters who are trying to get living wages for cafeteria workers in the same way that they do people who are trying to get Harvard to divest from Israel.
They came down so heavily, not because of BDS, but because those protests at that particular point in time in the spring of 2024, they were everywhere, seizing the imagination of Americans. They were the embodiment of support for Gaza at that particular point, and they were clearly spreading not only across the United States but internationally. They were spreading, and they presented a public relations disaster for Israel supporters, and that's when the alumni kicked in to destroy them. So I do believe, without going into the fine details now, as I said, because you asked me to comment on BDS, I was saying I don't believe that there is one pat formula that's applicable in every situation at every point in time. And I said, as an example, I think right now, it's not to try to mobilize the entire student population in favor of divestment. It has to be to mobilize the student population and the faculty in support of the right to talk about Gaza. You can't talk about it now. Forget about talk about genocide. You can't even talk about Gaza.
Is that a false? Is that sort of falsely breaking apart the issue and then ranking?
A false dichotomy.
But also the ranking. We can only do one thing and it has to be this thing, which is separate and apart from the BDS issue.
It's a question of.
It feels like the class first, race first discourse of 2017.
Well, actually, that actually is an important issue, the ranking. And why? Because those who wanted to stop the Bernie juggernaut, and it was a juggernaut in 2020, and it did look unstoppable, the way they tried to stop it was to play that the Bernie is weak on the race issue. It did become a conflict between the liberal establishment and the whole fake left.
It did. In the way that became a cudgel, the way that they weaponized the discourse was to say, you have to pick race or class, you have to rank race first, and if you don't, you're a racist Bernie bro. So that's why I'm kind of allergic to the idea of forcing people into what is like a false dichotomy.
Any political struggle has some sort of ranking. Bernie Sanders clearly ranked Medicare for all as his key issue. And then there were
but that's a little bit of a different. That's a little bit of a different debate.
I don't want to. Okay, because as I said, I have some legal issues I have to attend to tonight to prepare. I can't devote the amount of time it would require. So I said I would give, so to speak, some bullet points, maybe for another conversation. So number one, I recoil at the idea that there is a abracadabra formula in politics. One has to constantly, as I said earlier, see what the balance of forces are, see what's possible, see what's not possible, make an assessment, and then put forth demands which are attainable at a given historical moment. Number two, there's no question in my mind that there has been, from the time I wrote the article, chapter in the book, which was never published 10 years ago, there has been a dramatic shift in public opinion. And you can say a shift in the tolerance of the public for kinds of demands which would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. As we both agreed, maybe 2 years ago, whether or not funding Iron Dome is a good idea would seem like a radical idea to say no. But nowadays, it's totally beside the point. We're way past whether or not to fund Iron Dome. We're well in the territory of whether we should fund anything, or whether we should veto criticism of Israel in the UN Security Council. So we're way past it. So I agree with that. And then the challenge now is to figure out what should be the right demands to meet the new balance of forces on this particular question. And I don't have an answer. I've already said I don't have an answer to that question. The third point I would make is my main concern with BDS, which I don't believe has changed at all, is the following. And if you'll forgive me, I'm going to leave off here because I have to retain the presence of mind to do what else I have to do tonight. My main concern is this, Brianna. There's a very big one second, let me just turn this off. There's a very big difference between speaking to the choir and trying to reach a broad public. In order to reach a broad public, you have to be very internally consistent. Otherwise, you're a sitting duck for the opposition. They're going to poke holes in you. As I said in the previous program, never smart to underestimate your enemy. Never smart to underestimate your enemy. So I had to be very careful politically, but also morally. I feel most comfortable arguing a point when I know it's accurate and true, and I believe it. I feel very uncomfortable being asked to perform a role which is not true to who I am. So, and I've been put in that position many times because people think I'm a very effective hatchet man. So they task me with doing a hatchet job that I don't want to do. I don't want to be a hatchet man. I want to be able to look at the full picture, all the facts, and be faithful to the facts, even though I may come to the same conclusion as the person who hired me to be a hatchet man, so to speak, hired me to be a hatchet man. So where does that leave us in terms of the question you put to me? BDS was formed in July 2005. It was formed after the International Court of Justice rendered a historic opinion on the wall that Israel was building in the occupied Palestinian territories in the West Bank. And the opinion registered many judgments. It said the Palestinians constitute a people. Under international law, if they're a people, they have the right to self-determination. It said that the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, are occupied Palestinian territories. It said that those occupied Palestinian territories are the designated territorial unit for the state of Palestine. And these were extremely important to the extent that law ever is, but you could say those were nonetheless extremely important victories for the Palestine movement, because now you can anchor your cause very firmly in international law, which wasn't the case before. The law was kind of murky on many issues, but now the court decided. The decision was 14-1, the American Bergenthal. He didn't issue a dissent, he issued a separate opinion, a declaration, I believe. In any event, so BDS comes along in 2005, and it issues its statement of principles. And it says its statement of principles is that it's anchored in international law. So there we were on the same page. It's anchored in international law. I too believe that the best strategy at this particular juncture, I have to always emphasize that because politics change. At this particular juncture, international law was our most powerful weapon. By the way, in the 1970s, 60s, and 70s, international law was a complete irrelevance. You know, the left was about national liberation struggles, armed struggle. Nobody gave a darn about international law.
Seems like maybe they were onto something, given the
it was a different
impotency
era.
of international law.
It was a different.
Well, there's an argument that international law was always impotent and that the ICC, as you know, is the International Caucasian Court, and it was always a fig leaf.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to get into that right now, but the perspective changed. Many of the people on the left in the 60s, you know where they migrated? They migrated into the human rights organizations. They went from being Maoists and such things. They joined Amnesty International, they joined Human Rights Watch, and they joined because they recognized the era had changed. And as I said, politics is what's maximum possible given the balance of power, balance of forces, political forces. And they realized the maximum now in this era was international law and the human rights community and things like that. So we were on the same page, BDS and I. But there was one problem. The BDS said, we're agnostic on the question of Israel. I said, well, if you're anchoring yourself in international law, you can't be agnostic because every international legal institution acknowledges the legitimacy of the state of Israel and calls for a two-state settlement. So if I go to a presentation and I say I'm agnostic, so my enemies who are I won't say numberless, but a large number, and they come well equipped. And whenever I give a talk, I always begin by saying that I respect the fact that you came to listen to me. I respect the fact that you listened patiently and quietly and respectfully. And therefore, you get to ask the first three questions, like people who do not like what I had to say. So the first person comes up and says, Professor Finkelstein, where do you stand to say of Israel? If I said, I'm agnostic, wait, what do you mean you're agnostic? You're
Right,
firm. You're firm on the Palestinian right to self-determination and statehood because you said that's an international law. But now you're suddenly saying you're agnostic on the state of Israel.
When I was reading your chapter, what was interesting to me is that elsewhere you acknowledged, but elsewhere as an important through line of your reasoning as to why you didn't support BDS was that public opinion was not with the BDS movement the same way it was with the South African apartheid divestment movement. And that you would basically get backlash from the public if you did anything that was perceived as undermining the existence of Israel. And I think that may or may not have been, that might have been perfectly true at the time. That being said, if we acknowledge that there was so much hostility, there was none of the goodwill that Palestine is enjoying right now, earned tragically and horribly because of this genocide. But if none of that existed, then you can see why the BDS leaders might frankly object to the existence of Israel, just like many people now are responding, does Israel have a right to exist? No, it doesn't as a Jewish supremacist country. No, countries don't have the right to exist. This is something that you're only allowed to say now in the last 6 weeks or so. So back then, it feels to me like it might not be about ideological inconsistency that the leaders of BDS were wanted to remain agnostic on the question of Israel's existence, but that they frankly were against it or didn't feel like it had a right to exist, but couldn't say it out loud for the reasons that you understood in the other context.
That's exactly my point. I never said you don't have a right to that opinion. I never said you didn't have the right to say it.
So would you then have supported BDS 10 years ago if they had said, no, I don't think Israel as a Jewish state has the right to exist?
Brianna, I just told you that was the base. I believed at that point, our most powerful weapon was international law. And the international law was very clear on that question. So you want me to say I support international law and then claim I'm agnostic on the fundamental question. Every single document that was issued by the UN or any international legal body, every single document called for a two-state settlement.
Is it not congruent to say you support international law where the law is correct and don't support international law when you feel like it's incorrect? I mean, we live in a country, Norm, where we have a long history of, but wait, Norm, we live in a country where we have a long history of laws that were illegal and that's why, or immoral, and that's why we have civil disobedience. Just because international law establishes the rights of the child or some such thing doesn't mean I have to agree with it when it says that Israel allows to can exist as frankly as an apartheid state, as a Jewish supremacist state.
But that's not what you can both lean on the law and reject the law.
But certainly you can. The whole history of civil rights legislation or litigation is using the law to argue as to why certain other laws or prohibitions shouldn't be the law.
But
you work. That's a whole.
Yeah,
I mean, there certainly were civil rights advocates who, frankly, did not support that approach because it had its limitations.
Yeah, because the claim was the law itself was immoral. The law, for example, the law that legalized slavery, the laws that legalized the Jim Crow system, the laws that, well, you can fill in the rest.
Yeah, and the legal, and you're, help me if I misunderstand, but you're saying that the international consensus under international law was that Israel had a right to exist, and they were trying to use. And they were trying to use other international legal statements or claims to the rights of the Palestinian people as the basis for the BDS movement.
I began by laying out the law. Palestinians are a people. People have the right to self-determination, including state, and so on and so forth. Jews are a people. Jews have the right to self-determination and statehood. Israel.
Wait a minute. These are different things. You and I both know that the issue with Israel isn't that Jews live there. The argument is that to maintain it as a Jewish state requires demographic rigging that leads to the conditions of apartheid and genocide.
I never even got to the question of a Jewish state. I was still at the question of a state.
Right, but the question that the BDS that you did get to, right? The statement of the BDS movement that you objected to is the agnosticism on the question of a Jewish state.
You can't claim that you are anchoring your position in international law, and then in a key component of that international law, you claim to be agnostic. That's as if to say, I have the right to walk at the green, and then I'm walking on the red, and an officer wants to issue me a ticket. And I say to the officer, well, I think I have the right to walk on the green, and I'm agnostic on the red. No, if you have the right to walk on the green, you're not allowed to walk on the red. That's why under international law, we speak about rights and obligations.
I don't know that I agree with that analogy, but I also think that might be beside the point, because I think the bigger question that I had when I was reading this was, if you had an issue with another point in the chapter you bring up, you don't like how the BDS management was going about, the leadership was going about it. There are these other complaints. I could have problems with an organization and how they're going about doing what they're doing, or even some internal logical inconsistencies with their policy approach. I might say the same of Black Lives Matter. But if you ask me, do I support Black Lives Matter, the principles and the policies that they were fighting for, my answer would be yes. And as I have heard you spoken about and your objection to BDS discussed, it has been holistic. It hasn't been, well, Norm Finkelstein didn't like the people who ran the BDS movement in 2005. It has been, he opposes the idea of boycotting products from Israel.
No, that's absolutely untrue. Long before BDS came around, I was going to churches' annual conventions like the Presbyterians, calling for a boycott. I've always said, of course, I support BDS with a small b, a small d, and a small s. Boycott, divestment, sanctions. How can any person in the left quarrel with those sorts of tactics? I said I oppose BDS, capital B, capital D, capital S, an organized movement with a statement of principles, a leadership, and so forth. To construe that as me, I mean, I doubt there are many more people who are more involved in trying to get groups to.
But Norma, you have to know that the statement that is made is much broader and more flat. Norm Finkelstein doesn't support BDS, just like his mentor Chomsky, he doesn't support BDS. Like that's the I would argue the public understanding.
I am aware of what people say, but sometimes, as I'm sure you know from personal experience, a significant distance separates, sometimes an abyss, separates what people say about you and your beliefs and what they actually are.
Well, it's just curious to me that this hasn't been cleared up earlier then, because you have to know that it's been used as a sort of cudgel to undermine your...
A lot of things are used to undermine me. They say I'm a Holocaust denier. They say I'm a self-hating Jew. A lot of things are said against me. I mean, even Alan Dershowitz said my mother was a capo. She was a Nazi collaborator. All sorts of things are said. But at some point, as you know, I never look at the social media. Never, absolutely never. I'm probably the only one on planet Earth who has never been on Facebook. I don't even know what Facebook is. And I steer clear of my Wikipedia entry. Terrified.
Same.
You know, what they're going to say, because at some point you have to make a choice. Are you going to be sucked into those battles, or are you going to, my favorite, I think God's greatest creation was the ostrich. Just bury your head in the ground, or in my case, bury my head in my work. And don't look left, don't look right, don't look backward, and of course, look forward. Well, I do look backward, of course, judging where I was right and where I was wrong. That's responsible. But I'm not going to spend my time trying, oh no, that's not true, sounding like Lady Macbeth. She doth protest too much. No, I have a record. I'm 72 years old. I have a record. And I think my record, at least in terms of personal commitment, has held up as well as anybody, and probably better than most people. So I'm not going to worry myself to death over the various claims that are made against me. I have a record, and you know what? I also spent a large amount of time documenting it.
Well, it does feel, Norm, like this one is pretty easily cleared up. And so I'm grateful.
Unfortunately, that book was never published.
Well, that's why I really wanted us to talk about it and to get a chance to get your sort of clarifications on the record, as it were. And to say, it's just short version for clipping purposes. Norm Finkelstein, you do support lowercase b, lowercase d, lowercase s.
How could I not support boycott, divestment, sanctions? That would be just kind of crazy.
And there we have it. We got our soundbite. I got another 30 minutes out of you. I'm feeling like we can end it here.
Oh, I'm sorry. The thing with us always is we start a conversation before the tape begins, and then it just goes in all sorts of unanticipated directions. However, I do believe it was, even though it wasn't what we set out to do, I do believe it was substantive. And I thought that you asked questions which I need to be asked, and also make clarifications. No, I don't believe Jews are in the position now of immigrants facing ICE. We're in a totally different category. But I do think that some strange things happened since October 7th. Namely, Israel became a right-wing issue. Very strange. Yeah. And now they've become the spokesperson for the issue. They're the go-to people. Very strange. Yeah. And also, as I said, problematic.
Well, maybe I just got to get Candace Owens on the show and talk her through it.
I'll tell you, it's a hard thing for me to do because those people have a very large reach.
Yeah.
And part of me wonders, is now the time to be criticizing them, because that means I won't have access to them. And
Yeah, I mean,
I
yeah.
do think twice about that.
Yeah.
In case you haven't noticed, I'm not asked on any platforms, any,
Yeah.
except for my friends on the left. That's it. And even there, it's very narrow, very narrow. And as I said, after October 7th, I became the most popular boy in the block. And that now has changed a lot. And I'm getting really angry email. And it means I put limits on my reach again. It happened, that BDS counseled me, I think around 2007. I can't remember exactly when. And for 10 years, I was never asked to speak on the subject because BDS controlled the SJPs, the Students for Justice in Palestine, in every college campus. And that was my venue, the SJPs. So I went, it was funny. I'll just tell one funny anecdote and then I have to take off. So I used to get paid $500 or $1,000, something like that, to go for these talks. And so if you give 40 talks a year, it means you get 40 1099s because you have to pay the tax on it. So I went to my accountant one year and I gave him 40 1099s. He adds it up, so you owe this much taxes. The accountant was an older Jewish fellow. And then the next year I come and he says, okay, give me the 1099s for your talks. And I handed to him one. What do you mean one? I said, one. He said, what happened? So I thought to myself, am I going to explain to this guy what I just did with Brianna? With BDS? No. This is not the time. This is not the place. I said, well, I'm old and people like novelty, so they got tired of me.
Well, let me tell you, I had a very not quite identical but similar. I was reluctant. I went from having a certain salary when I had Rising to having a very different, much lower salary afterward. And there was a conversation with my accountant, who also happens to be Jewish and who has expressed some interest in the show. We chat sometimes about what I'm covering and stuff, but I was assiduously avoiding discussing Israel with him because why? I don't need this. I don't need this with this man who's handling my money. And it finally came up. He brought it up. And he said, Brianna, this was maybe like last spring. He says, do you think it's a genocide? And I said, yes, name bleeped out. I think we're past that point. And he kind of sighs gravely and he's like, yeah, I think you're right. I'm like, all right, I'm glad we got there. I appreciate it. It was minchy of him to hold his tongue until he had gotten to the consensus point. But that's all to say, as we approach tax day tomorrow, as we're recording this, that I'm in the clear. I'm in the clear. We're both in the clear. Even if our salaries are lower, we're in the clear.
I was canceled, up until October 7th.
Mm.
Yeah, so it was about 10 years, maybe more. I can't remember right now. And so now, again, the thought occurs to me about, should I be burning this bridge because they have such a huge reach? But I decide that's my role. That's my function.
I will say that I do think a lot of them, for better or for worse, have an appetite for engaging with people they disagree with that's higher than liberals. So I imagine there's a world where you can sort of vociferously disagree on some subjects and they'll still be willing to have you on. Well, I imagine...
I know for a fact that's not correct. I just know it.
No?
From personal...
With anyone in particular? With anyone in particular? Okay.
I can tell you...
because I've had, people like Coleman Hughes and Glenn Lowry will come on repeatedly. And when I went on Candace, she said that she would come on bad faith. I haven't followed up because, frankly, I think I have a big responsibility to be willing to address some of the other topics that she speaks on that I certainly don't agree with. We didn't have the time and space on her show to get into it, but I suspect that we would if she were to come on Bad Faith. And so I just haven't followed up. But I also don't expect that if we had that exchange, that we would necessarily never have another exchange again, because at least part of their branding, core to their branding, unlike liberals, is that they have a willingness to do the discourse without there being a cancellation. So that may or may not bear out, but that would be my hope.
Well, not been my experience. So we'll leave it at that.
All right, Norm Finkelstein, I did not introduce you, but everyone hopefully is well aware of who you are and what your contributions are to this space. As the foremost expert on Gaza, and author of several books, including what I'm holding in my hand, Gaza: An Inquest into Its Martyrdom. Thank you, as always, for joining us here on Bad Faith Podcast. Do you want to tell the audience anything about where they can find you or any of your work?
What I would like to do is just say that I'm coming out with a new book, Gaza's Gravediggers, on the international reaction or lack thereof to what happened on October 7th and after. And I think I'll send you the link if you can put it in the YouTube notes at the bottom.
Perfect, will do.
Much. Because
Will
my
do.
publisher, who I like my publisher, but they get in my case when I forget that because my mind doesn't focus enough on it.
It's relatable. Thank you, as always, for spending the time, Norm, and good luck on your agenda tomorrow.
Yeah. Another day, another court case.
All right. Thanks to all of you for tuning into this episode of Bad Faith. As always, take care of yourselves and remember to keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.